Hello and welcome to the first World War II podcast of 2018. A very happy new year to you all. In this episode, we'll be looking at two British soldiers in occupied Burma. Major Hugh Seagrim operated for 2 years behind the lines, organising the Karen resistance before he was eventually forced to surrender. Seagrim crosses paths in the jungle with Roy Pagani. Roy is trying to make his way back to British lines after escaping as a POW working on the Burma Railway. Pagani is the most remarkable of men, as he has already escaped from Dunkirk and Singapore when it fell. But before we get started, just to remind you, if you enjoy the podcast every 2 weeks, why not help me to put the show together with a small recurring donation each month of $1 or so. It's easy to do via Patreon or PayPal, and you can find the details at www.podcast.com/donate. Those small donations help me to find the time to do this for you, and it's surprising the amount of time I have to put into researching, recording, editing, and the website and the whole social media thing. I do try to give something extra to supporters of the show with bits that were left on the cutting room floor, which I hope might be of interest. So that's www.podcast.com/donate to sign up via PayPal or Patreon. So joining me today is Phillip Davis. Phillip is the author of Lost Warriors, Seagrim and Pagani of Burma, the last great untold story of World War II. I can tell you now, it's a great read about two remarkable men. So thanks for joining me. Shall we start with Hugh Seagrim? Where is he from? What is his background? How was his upbringing?
I think it's fair to say Hugh Seagrim was the T. Lawrence of Burma. No one's ever heard of him. Seagrim was brought up with four brothers in a vicarage in Norfolk, in Wissenset, a fairly poverty-stricken upbringing. His father was the local vicar. So he had a sort of basic C of E family background, but there was nothing to suggest that he would develop a very intense sort of spiritual dimension to his character, which he did subsequently, even before he went to Burma. So his background is this, the youngest of the five sons, all of whom went into the army in different roles. He was always at school. He went to school in Norwich, King Edward's School in Norwich, and with his older brother Derek, the two of them were there, and a third brother Jack, and they had something of a reputation at the school even then. Derek being a very sort of heroic figure, you want to come in to sort of save the day in the cricket match, for the school. But Hugh had a very different reputation as being a sort of prankster, practical joker. And people tended not to take him that seriously. And when he left school, he went to Sandhurst, where he came, pretty much towards the bottom of his class at Sandhurst. So there was nothing, and again, had this reputation as a practical joker. One stage he set off a whole series of potties across the lake at Sandhurst with cannons in them. Another case, he sort of hauled with cannon, the ceremonial cannon at Sandhurst, down to the lake, and all sort of juvenile pranks like this, which didn't exactly endear him to his superiors. So, very little to suggest that he would be one of the most effective guerrilla leaders of the Second World War. So, he left Sandhurst and went to join the British Indian Army, and had a couple of postings in India. But very soon it became evident he was not the conventional British Army officer. He didn't relish regimental life that much. He, whenever the opportunity arose, cut himself off and went off on long treks up into the Himalayas initially, and then after he was posted to Burma, he spent a couple of months in meditation, actually, in a Buddhist monastery on the shores of the Andaman Sea. And on another occasion, he actually went to Japan before the Second World War, was very impressed by what he saw in Japan. And he came back with this very, very distinct individualistic take on really conventional army life and army tactics. And he was hugely frustrated by this sort of rather sort of blinkered, ossified approach by the military to the forthcoming threats, not just in Europe, but particularly in the East. And he thought that the British tactics were completely out of date, defensive-minded, echoes of the First World War, fighting around sort of defensive battles around highly sort of fortified positions, which was completely irrelevant in the jungles of the Far East. So he went to Staff College in Quetta, which is now in Pakistan, in India, then, which was where a lot of the training was done for the British Indian Army. And it was very, very outspoken to his superiors. He called them sort of utter blockheads. He called the cavalry horse wallopers. And he actually, in parallel with that, developed this sort of reputation as being rather an eccentric. He started collating a private anthology of spiritual quotations of poetry, which he had on a stand in his rooms, and he would read out loud to anyone who was sort of passing or who came to sort of visit him. Very, very profound poetic spiritual insights into the sort of meaning of life, which was fascinating and very, very much unlike any sort of conventional regular army officer. So there are these twin poles of his personality. There's the sort of maverick military thinker who believes that, if you're going to fight a war in the Far East, you've got to live off the jungle. You've got to make the jungle your friend. You can't sort of rely on all these sort of old-fashioned tactics that are 30 years out of date. But in parallel with that, he's developing this very, very powerful insight into, as I say, the deeper meaning of life. And by reading his anthology, which is absolutely fascinating, you can see how he sort of had some sort of inkling of his own personal destiny. He explains why he never married, because he said you can't be a hero and a saviour of mankind. So he had these sort of grandiose sort of ideals that he followed, and you can't do that if you're tied to one particular individual. But throughout his anthology, it's full of quotations from people who've done very heroic things in life, like Captain Oates in the Antarctic and from Scott's Diary. And he obviously deeply believed that he had this sort of destiny, which makes him even more interesting, because he's such an extraordinary character that's so unlike, as I say, the conventional Indian Army officer or regular Army officer.
Well, it struck me as one of those funny English families where they didn't necessarily have enough wealth to be aristocratic, so they either became clergymen, civil servants, or joined the army.
Exactly. Yeah, classic upbringing, English upbringing, that period. Yeah, and all five of them went into the army. And actually, what is not in the book is that the other of the five sons. I mean, they all had very different sort of destinies. I mentioned about Derek, who's his closest brother, who wins the VC in Tunisia and in the Western Desert. Posthumously, he's killed shortly after the award is made. And then one of his other brothers, who actually goes mad and is actually put into an asylum in England, probably through heat stroke in India, actually. So there's only so much one can put into a book. So we concentrate on the key figures, really. And
and when he gets there, it's that strange, almost paternal. It's almost like it comes across anyway to me as a sort of a paternal instinct he has when he gets to these tribal areas. I mean, can he speak the language? He
was dyslexic. So actually, he had a really good memory. So he was actually not that good at spoken Burmese, but could learn Karen. And it's the Karens that he spent his time with, and immediately developed this very close bond, as many people serving in the Indian Army did with the troops under their command. And in this case, for him, it was the Karens. And the Karens had this very interesting sort of background in that they had this deep their own set of beliefs that coexisted alongside the sort of Baptist tradition that they were sort of converted to by missionaries. And one of those is that there would be this white brother from across the seas who would come and save them in their hour of need. And of course, they saw, as the situation deteriorated in Burma, they saw Seagrim as this sort of charismatic white brother from across the seas who come to help them. I mean, many of the Karens at the time said he loved us and we loved him. So this wasn't just a sort of convenient relationship between, an army officer and the troops and the culture that they came from. This was a very, very personal, deep-felt relationship on both sides.
Yeah. He's certainly not the gin and polo Indian army officer.
Certainly not. No. He obviously he sort of, I think he probably always despised that. He broke away from that. He even went out with a Burmese girlfriend for a while before the war. Again, which in that sort of very conventional sort of colonial background was frowned on. And that's probably why he did it.
So at the outbreak of war, there's just 44 British officers controlling 3 million tribesmen. And they're the remote hill regions, aren't they?
That's right. So in Burma, there's the sort of central plain with Burman majority population who are Buddhists, and then in the arc all the way around the perimeter of Burma, the hill tribes. So there's obviously you're hearing the moment about the Rohingya, but there's the Chin, the Kachin, the Wa, who are sort of animists, and the Karen, so the principal groups around the sort of perimeter. The Karens are in the sort of eastern side of Burma along the Thai border, and then another group down in the delta. And they're intelligent, articulate people, but all of the hill tribes have always been treated as second-class citizens by the Burman majority in Burma. And that predates any sort of British involvement. This goes back hundreds of years. So the current problems in Burma are very much a reflection of those sorts of tensions.
Were they loyal to the British, or were they just happy to bump along with us? Why does it take just 44 British officers? Well,
that's exactly why they were loyal to the British, because they resented central authority from the Burman majority in Rangoon, or prior to that in Mandalay when the sort of royal court was there. They really resented having interference from this powerful group over their own affairs in the hills. So there was always a lot of tension. And when the British arrived initially in the 1820s and then later in Upperburn in the 1980s, they were intensely loyal to the British simply because the British ruled with a very light hand. I mean, there were so few officers. It was a classic way of administering an empire that you had direct rule only where necessary and indirect rule wherever possible. So they simply let most of the existing structures, village headmen and the like, just remain in place. So the tribes really valued their autonomy. They were treated very benignly by the frontier service. One of the frontier officers, for instance, used to go and collect taxes, and he used to collect taxes from each of the villages, and then would leave a little bit more back. He would give money back for them to maintain the roads, which was entirely spurious sort of affair. But he always gave them back a little bit more than he raised. So had a little bit of money to sort of do something good. So they really valued this, and having had that sort of autonomy for something like 40 years, certainly after the 1880s till right through to the sort of Second World War, a whole generation grew up. They were running their own affairs pretty much. They weren't interfered with by central authority. There was, the old frontier officer would be there, or police superintendent, and it was just very successful. So they immediately realised they certainly didn't want the Japanese coming in and telling them what to do, and they didn't want the Burman government telling them what to do. So that's why they were so loyal to the British.
So it's after I think I'm right in saying it's after he returns from the Staff College at Quetta. He's recruited by Noel Stevenson. Now, I didn't make a note of it, but is he SOE?
No, well, Noel Stevenson was he was the head of the Frontier Service of the frontier officers who administered those hill regions, and very very early on worked out that if the Japanese did arrive, you'd need to have irregular forces of operating in the hills. And when SOE, in the form of something called Oriental Mission, flew out just as before, things were really falling apart in the Far East, to try and set up at the last minute left behind parties and sabotage and resistance. Noel Stevenson and Oriental Mission came together and pooled their ideas and resources, and that became the basis of SOE in the Far East, which was Force 136. And Seagrim was the first recruit. Because he knew the hills so well, he'd lived amongst the people in the Karens. He trekked, often by himself through the country. So he knew the frontier areas certainly almost better than anybody else.
So, and what is their plan? In the event of Burma falling, or indeed as it does fall, what is the plan for the tribesmen when they're surrounded, I guess, when they're occupied?
Well, the idea was that there would be left behind parties, odd British officers left up in the hills, who would mobilise not just the Karens but the Kachins and others to actually form a guerrilla army against the Japanese, ready to strike when the sort of right time comes, but also to gather intelligence and to transmit that sort of intelligence back to army headquarters in India. But it didn't work out like that. That's what happened. I mean, the speed of the Japanese advance into Burma meant that, and all this was put into place, very, very late in the day. By the time the Japanese had swept in, Seagrim and two other officers who were in eastern Burma were ordered to get out because I think British realised that it was fairly hopeless. The two others did leave and extricated themselves, but Seagrim refused to go. He said, his place was with the Karens. So he volunteers to stay. Having initially volunteered to go up in the hills, he volunteers to stay and remain. He doesn't then have a radio. So he's immediately, once the Japanese have swept up and through Burma, he's isolated hundreds of miles behind the Japanese lines with the Karens, no other company, a European company at all, and without a radio. So his tactic is, let's prepare the ground to have a resistance army in place ready to strike when the time comes. There is then something, sort of, as the Japanese are advancing, in their wake come the Burma Independence Army, which is sort of pro-Japanese Burmans generally, who are pretty scurrilous lot. And they go around looting and raping and pillaging in the hills, the Karen Hills. And Seagrim's guerrillas, irregulars, then strike back at them and establish some sort of security for a while in the hills while the Japanese are concentrating on consolidating their hold on the country. And Seagrim sort of realises that the moment it's not the right moment to sort of raise a great rebellion. So he goes into hiding. He moves from place to place, living in bamboo huts deep in the jungle, supplied by his Karen friends, all the time saying the British will be coming back. We just need to bide our time, and lays the sort of foundations for the guerrilla campaign that will rise later in the war.
And it's at this point where he's hiding in the jungle, and if his story is not remarkable enough, he crosses paths with Roy Pagani, who, if Roy did nothing else during the war, up to this point, he's already had possibly the most remarkable war I've ever heard of. So what was Roy doing stumbling around the jungle?
Well, I mean, this is what makes this whole story quite sensational, I think, is that here you have, Seagrim, who's like the T. Lawrence of Burma, way behind the Japanese lines, isolated, out of contact with the rest of the Allies, mobilising this sort of secret army of Karen guerrillas. And then, out of the blue, entirely sort of unexpectedly, he's joined by a British corporal who has this remarkable tale to tell. And Pagani's background is he's a regular squaddie. He has the sort of quite dysfunctional upbringing, having been abandoned by his father in the south of France at the age of 4, brought up in a convent in the south of France. So very, very self-reliant sort of individual. Joins the army, serves in, before the war in Sudan, a few other places. And then at the outbreak of war, he's at Dunkirk. In the retreat from Dunkirk, he goes back towards the beaches rather than stay with his mates and go back, try and get his way back across the channel. He breaks away from his friends. He goes in the opposite direction to everybody else. He finds a boat and rows himself back across the channel in 3 days and lands on a sort of fairly remote beach in Suffolk, I think, Shingle Street. Promptly then get the train back to Colchester, walks back to his mother-in-law's house, knocks on the door, and she promptly faints when she sees it. Just arrived back from Dunkirk. Anyway, he carries on in the army. He then is sent to Singapore, and he arrives having been on the Empress of Asia ship that was bombed just on the outside the harbour in Singapore, full of equipment, arms, and things that might have tipped the balance actually in the battle for Singapore. Anyway, he arrives almost just prior to the surrender. There's some fighting, but again he says, "I'm not surrendering. So sod this, I'm off." He breaks away again. He goes through the burning city to the harbour. Finds a small sampan packed full of fish manure, and then promptly sails across to Sumatra through the most horrendous storm that many who did escape from Singapore remember, this fearful sort of tropical cyclone that hits them as they're at sea. In his own personal memoir, he doesn't mention that there were 3 other people with him, actually, so his accounts slightly differ. But there were 3 others with him, and when they get to Sumatra, quite clearly he was a pretty hard taskmaster, and the other 3 disappear. And he then goes right across to Sumatra, thinking he's going to get a ship back to India with a load of other POWs, about 1,000 of them. But they don't. None of those ships are sunk. The Japanese then catch up with them, and he's caught by the Japanese. And then after a couple of months with the other British POWs, Allied POWs, he's taken off by ship to Burma and put to work on the Burma Railway. And when they arrive at the Burma Railway, the commander says, couldn't hide his derision for the Allied soldiers more than by saying, that this railroad will be built, on the bodies of your comrades, more or less. Paraphrase. Any attempt to escape will be met with an instant execution, basically. Pagani, after about a month, thinks, well, I'm not going to survive if I stay here, because the camps on the railway are so remote. They're not enclosed in any way. They're just bamboo huts in clearings in the jungle. The working parties go off to the railway each day. So he hangs back and feigns illness one morning, and then says he'll go and catch up a working party, and then disappears into the jungle. And his friends, a number of his friends remember this very well. And apparently he said to one of them, "Well, so long then, I'm off." And walked off into the jungle.
It's amazing. It's huge self-confidence just to...
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's strange in a strange land. It's not as if it's northwest Europe where he thinks he might be able to get away with it. Yeah. The jungle's...
And he thinks he's inconspicuous because he's quite short. He obviously by then tanned, walks barefoot everywhere, so like a native, imitates the gait of what he says is a native. But quite clearly, he must be pretty conspicuous, and he had a puggery around his head to sort of look like an Indian labourer. But he did have a huge tattoo across his chest, which is pretty much, and he was sort of had a red beard as well. So anyway, he seemed to think he was inconspicuous. But as he left the camp, he then worked his way through to the coast. Determined to get as much distance between him and the camp as possible. He gets to the coast, can't find a boat to escape in, so he then follows the line of the railway down through Thambayuziat, which is where the big Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery is now, and walks literally directly into a Japanese patrol that are coming straight towards him, and simply coolly turns around, sits in a ditch, squats in a ditch as though he's urinating, with his back to the patrol, and they just walk straight past him. And as he's walking through Thambayuziat, there's people sort of pointing to him, and local people think he's a Japanese plant, Japanese spy. So he was obviously not that inconspicuous at all. Anyway, he sort of works his way along the line of the railway, staying with usually Indian labourers who are quite sympathetic to the British, and in one case an ex-Indian soldier. And he's guided quite by chance around Mool Mine, which is the great sort of town there full of Japanese, works his way up further up the coast, and then in sort of lying up outside the village in some desperation, being hungry, cold, really needing some support. And he watches this village and realizes the people there are not Burmese, but they're Karens, different dress, sort of different appearance. So he summons up his courage, goes up to the door of one of the houses there, knocks on the door, and is astonished when the door opens. And he's greeted by this young, very attractive young girl who immediately recognises he's English and says, "Oh, please come in." And he goes in, and he has this surreal experience of in this house in this small village being treated to tea in bone china, sandwiches beautifully cut for him, a feather bed that he's allowed to sleep in, a hot bath. It was an absolutely surreal experience. And then, quite by chance, by luck, he had knocked on the house of the local Karen elder, who then comes home in the evening, meets him and dissuades him from his initial ambition of working right the way across Burma back to India. He said it's suicidal, he'll never make it. But there is this British major up in the hills, Hugh Seagrim. He said, wouldn't the answer be to conduct you up there? And he quietly takes soundings from Seagrim through various different runners and things up the hills. Seagrim says, "We'll send him on up, but if he's a Japanese plant, he'd be killed straight away." Anyway, he's sent up into the hills. He goes off, buried under a pile of manure, actually to avoid the Japanese sort of roadblocks and things, taken up into the hills. And as soon as he's in the hills, there's no Japanese presence at all. And he rides on the back of an elephant right the way through the jungle. And then there is this sort of epic sort of Stanley and Livingstone moment when he's conducted through the jungle, across, through deeper and deeper and deeper into the jungle, across rivers, and until he comes to a clearing. And in the clearing, he sees this very, very tall, 6'4" individual, suntanned, very, very long hair, jump down off the veranda. And he thinks he's this guy's local village headman. And he greets Pagani and says, "Oh, hello, old chap," as though he's sort of welcoming to an English country house. And Pagani is absolutely flabbergasted. And then they spend time together. They bond very quickly, inevitably, in those sort of situations. Pagani is immediately impressed by this sort of charismatic figure with his extraordinary sort of leadership qualities and this very, very deep spiritual dimension to his character. And they spend a long time talking about their experiences. And Pagani explains to him how he's escaped from the railway, what's happening to the POWs on the railway, the atrocities, and how he was determined to get this information back to the Allies. And for a while they stay together, and then Seagrim realises he's got the ideal right-hand man, so he sends Pagani off to tour his whole sort of realm in the hills, if you like, amongst the Karen commanders. He's sent to sort of try and whip them into shape and make them sort of a bit more responsive to sort of discipline. Pagani does this great tour of the hills, which is he described in great detail in his own personal sort of memoir. Before coming back, but now in the process of coming back, the military activity is increasing in the hills. The BIA, the Independence Army, start being very active. Pagani launches an attack on the BIA, which is very successful, including which leads to increasing Japanese involvement in the hills. And as Pagani tries to find his way back to Seagrim has already gone into hiding because of all of the increased activity, the search for him. And so he thinks, well, what do I do? So Pagani reverts to his original plan of trying to escape right the way across Burma back to India, and off he goes. Meanwhile, Seagrim's in hiding. Seagrim sort of remains deep in the jungle, supplied by just a few trusted people. And to resume Pagani's story, he then goes off with, again, a very, very loyal, initially a small group of them, but he sends the other sort of few refugee Gurkhas back into the hills. And it's just him and someone called Lance Naik Mura. Mura is a Kachin who absolutely is devoted to Pagani and is like his bodyguard and protector. And they trek off across Burma, across the great central plain of Burma, where they're very, very conspicuous and where all of the locals are pro-Japanese. And twice Pagani's almost killed, chased by howling mobs of Burmese through the jungle. They become separated. And Pagani eventually, after a series of adventures, reaches the Irrawaddy River. And across the Irrawaddy is the prospect of some status. There's more Karens there, and he can probably work his way,
It's the front line, I think, isn't it, the Irrawaddy?
Well, it's the front line's further over into the Arakan, but yeah, that time. His chances of success were increasing. And he plunges into the Irrawaddy, extraordinary. But before doing so, he realises that if he's caught again, and the Japanese realise he's escaped from the Burma Railway, he'll be executed on the spot. So he assumes an alternative identity and thinks, well, I'll say I'm an American airman. Because rather mistakenly, he says, well, there aren't many Americans in Burma, but he does see American planes going up. And he takes the name of his son, so he knew he wouldn't forget it if he was being tortured. Anyway, he plunges into the Irrawaddy and then gets caught in the current, taken 5 miles downstream, washed up on the same bank, exhausted. And while he's lying there, another group of Burmese grab him, and he tries to make a run for it, and they pounce on him, and he's shot with a shotgun. He hears this explosion, and what he thinks is a snarling dog behind him, and actually the snarling dog is him breathing through his lungs. Red clots of blood are coming out of his damaged lung. And he's almost hacked to pieces by the Burmese mob. Handed over to the Japanese, and the Japanese, with sort of great brutality, sort of stitch him up without any ancestry or anything. And at that moment, he thinks he will commit suicide because he's in such intense pain. But before he set off to war, he made this great promise to his wife that no matter what befell him, whatever happened to him, he would always find his way back to her. And he's lying on face down in this hut in the grounds of the hospital in Prome, and tries to suffocate himself with a towel. And as he's doing it, he thinks, no, I've made this promise, and I will keep it. And he sort of battles through this pain, and slowly, very slowly, begins to recover. And then he's handed over to the Kempeitai, the Japanese Gestapo, who then take him off to Rangoon. And he thinks when he gets to Rangoon, he'll just be thrown in a prison camp with his mates. But he's in for a really rude shock, because when he gets there, he's put into the headquarters of the Kempeitai, where even worse awaits. So over several months, he's then in these Pigpen cells in the middle of the new Law Courts building in Rangoon, which I visited just before they were demolished, and they were untouched from 1945.
Really? Completely untouched?
Absolutely, yeah, exactly as they were. And that was a really very evocative moment, actually, to see that. And he's systematically tortured, from all of the things you've read about Japanese methods of torture. He endures them. So he's beaten with clubs, he's whipped with canes, they do mock beheadings on him, just reversing the sword every time as it strikes his neck. And he's given the Japanese water torture, which leaves permanent psychological damage on him. Later, he always said he couldn't stand the sound of a dripping tap. But for weeks and weeks, he survives this. And then he's hauled off one day on the back of a lorry, thinking, well, this is it, he's going to be executed, as so many were. But he's taken to the Rangoon Central Jail and thrown out of the lorry and put into Rangoon Jail with other POWs, where he stays for a while till near the end of the war.
It amazes me that he gets away with pretending to be American until he gets to the camp, and the Americans say, well, you're British, we don't want you in the American camp. And the British say, but you're trying to be an American, we don't want you. At which point you wonder what the Japanese think when there's this poor guy where the Americans don't want him, and the British say, well, you can't be with us because you're pretending to be American, and he's trapped between the two.
It was just bizarre, and how the Japanese didn't realise that he wasn't American remains. It shows how ineffectual the torture, methods of torture and sort of interrogation were. And he says in his memoir, actually it was quite easy to fool them, because you sort of you sort of more or less knew the answer they wanted to hear, and then you sort of gave it to them. And sometimes, if you held out long enough, they would almost tell you the answer they wanted to hear. So he was very sort of shrewd, But in Rangoon Central Jail, I mean, the British soldiers called him the Yank from Battersea. A number of them I interviewed said, well, they remembered him very well, and he quite clearly wasn't. No one quite believed his story. They said, oh, it was all a bit preposterous, wasn't it?
It is preposterous, but, truth is stranger than fiction, and it keeps coming round again and again, these kind of peculiar stories.
So it was absolutely stranger than fiction, and that's why they couldn't believe it. And, he then explains what life in the POW camp was like. But while all this is going on, Seagrim is still up in the hills.
And the British haven't forgotten about him. This is what I find incredible. The British cut off. The British haven't really heard anything from him, but they haven't forgotten about him. They think he'll still be there.
Well, they have a shrewd idea he might still be there. And then some information comes out through a very, very circuitous route through, some of the, I think it's the second Chindit expedition. They come across some Karens who are in the western side of the country who said that they saw this white man up in the hills in the east about sort of 3 or 4 months previously. So when that word gets back to India, and there's sort of a lot of thought in India that maybe he's still alive and they should try and re-establish contact and at the very least get a radio there. So they launched something called Operation Harlington, which starts in 4 stages. The idea was the first stage was they would drop a Karen and a small party in to join, to see if he's still alive, sort of scout out the lie of the land. And if it looks all very promising, then they would then subsequently drop in a radio transmitter. Well, the first stage goes beautifully. They drop in someone called Lieutenant Barjour, who's a Karen, very, very brave individual who was part of the retreat from Burma, actually, one of the sort of epic treks out of Burma. Barjour very quickly establishes contact with Seagrim. The two of them, carry on preparing the ground for this guerrilla campaign. But it takes 8 months to drop a radio transmitter to him. Right the way, most of 1943, there's about 20 attempts to take a radio transmitter to drop into him. And it's just frustrated time after time after time usually by the weather conditions. And I mean, it's very easy from a distance to think, oh, well, why did it take so long? But actually the flying conditions were horrendous. And huge numbers of people lost their lives trying to sort of just fly into the hills.
Oh, indeed. Ord Wingate himself went and died in a plane crash.
Yeah, and so I think the climatic conditions in that part of Burma were awful, and the flying conditions were appalling. So eventually, after 8 months, they do manage to drop a transmitter in, and then the subsequent phases are to drop in some British officers and support, someone called Jimmy Nimmo and Eric McCrindle, and they are both in separate stages dropped in to join him, and immediately they establish contact with Seagrim. They are allocated areas of the hills to operate in and to lead the local Karen guerrillas. And a stream of intelligence is then transmitted back to Allied HQ, which has a major impact on the campaign in Burma. So they're sending back information on ammunition dumps, targets in eastern Burma for bombing, and priceless intelligence that Aung San Suu Kyi's father, who was led the Burma Independence Army, that subsequently becomes the sort of Burma Defence Army, changes his name various times. He realises he's completely disenchanted with the Japanese and wants to switch sides. And it's Seagrim who transmits that intelligence back to Army HQ, and Slim and obviously picks this up for the command of the army, and realises that there's this potential fifth column that could just change sides in an instant. This is quite important strategically. As I say, the grounds are then laid for this resistance campaign. All 3 British shots, Seagrim, Nimmo and McCrindle, are all very keen to raise the Karens and have a serious sort of uprising. But the message back from the Allies is, bide your time, it's not yet right, because we're not about to launch another major offensive for another sort of 9 months or so. Meanwhile, the Japanese are getting very, very concerned about this level of Allied activity in the hills. And Seagrim has deliberately circulated rumours that there's an entire battalion of British troops up in the hills still, just to sort of dissuade the Japanese and sort of mislead them, fake news, if you like. That is actually counterproductive to a certain extent, because the Japanese realise they've got to do something about this. So they send in these columns of troops into the hills to home in on the three of them. And initially they go for Eric McCrindle's camp, and McCrindle is shot as he's surprised early one morning. The next day they go for Jimmy Nimmo's camp, and again he's shot almost in identical circumstances. The others just scatter, his Karen colleagues. And then they go for Seagrim, and Seagrim gets wind of this, not through intelligence, but literally hears them coming through the jungle over the morning, and they scatter and break up his followers. And Seagrim eventually disappears, melts into the jungle again. The Japanese are incredibly frustrated. They can't sort of pin him down. As Seagrim is working his way through the jungle, he meets up with one or two of the Karens who are sort of fleeing with him, one of whom takes him to his relative who has a village. He's the village headman. He's taken and lives outside that village for a while. But the Japanese are absolutely hot on their heels and push the villagers of all the villages in the area to go out into the jungle and say, don't come back until you find out where Seagrim is and tell us, or there will be major reprisals. And in the process, they torture something like 200 Karens to try and track down Seagrim's whereabouts. And when Seagrim hears of this, lying up in the hills, he takes this very personal moral decision and says, I can't let the Karens suffer simply to protect my whereabouts. And calmly, on the 14th of March 1944, he simply decides to give himself up.
It's a remarkable selfless gesture.
Absolutely, to prevent the Karens from being tortured. Incredible sort of self-sacrifice involved in this. And so he walks into the Japanese camp, stands in the doorway of the commander of the Japanese dorm early one morning, and the Japanese commander wakes up and is astonished to see this figure standing in his doorway. And he said, I'm the person you've been looking for. He immediately gives him a glass of orange juice, and it's actually quite a civilized discussion between the two of them. And they shake hands, give him a glass of orange juice. He's exhausted, he hasn't eaten for 20 days. You're living off jungle rats, rhesus monk blood, drinking the blood of rhesus monkeys, to survive. And then Seagrim is taken off to Rangoon. But as he's leaving Rangoon, he sees one of his comrades who looks at him across the village. And Seagrim just hasn't lost his sort of irrepressible sense of humour, and he just winks at his colleague like that as he's hauled off. And he's taken to Parpoon, which is the sort of local capital, local village, and then down to Rangoon, where he's put into the same prison in the new law courts, the cells in the new law courts, where Roy Pagani had been held earlier. And his arrival in the cells galvanises the other POWs. They realise a number of reports, both of American airmen and British airmen who were in those cells, say that they were immediately struck by this tall, aristocratic-looking figure who perpetually maintained a good sense of humour. He never seemed to be ill because he was so used to living off the jungle and everything. Who was his irrepressible sort of spirit, constantly sort of poking fun at the Japanese, and the Japanese clearly respected him. And slightly later, some of the Japanese begin to call him Seagrim Master, which is extraordinary. For a nation where POWs are expected to bow and be very subservient, they recognised his extraordinary, powerful, charismatic character and spiritual sort of character. And as an aside, bizarrely, in the same building, on the top floor of the same building, are two Germans who've escaped, and their own remarkable story of escaped from a British POW camp in India, worked their way across India, thinking they'd reach Burma and join the Japanese, who were their erstwhile allies, only to be treated with great suspicion as sort of spies and kept in the same building. And they've left a testimony about Seagrim, only in passing, but saying he's in the cells in the same building as them at the same time. And they eventually, the two Germans are taken off to Tokyo and don't get back to Germany until well after the war in 1947, I think. All the time Seagrim's in prison, in the cells, he has this extraordinary impact and remains perpetually cheerful, even though he would think his entire network has been rolled up. A lot of the Karens, who his closest allies, are there with him. Quite a few of them are dying of disease in the cells. A British airman who dies, Seagrim conducts this quiet service for them, and another airman who wrote about it subsequently said he finished the burial service by saying about praying for his captors, saying, "Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do." So it's this incredible sort of spiritual attitude to the people who his tormentors. He's forgiving them as well.
It's almost like a spiritual journey he goes on, which almost allows him to. I wondered if it allows him to sort of bear the horrendous conditions of the prison.
Yeah. I think without question, he thinks that suffering has purpose, and that he's there to help others, and he pleads for the Karens all the time, saying and say to his fellow Europeans, say, look, treat the Karens must be regarded as one of us. There's one British airman in particular called Arthur Sharp who said he wished he could remember the words of this burial service, because he said it's one of the finest things he's ever heard. And without doubt, Seagrim was the finest gentleman he'd ever met. Seagrim he stays there for several months, and then is taken to Insane Prison, which is the second big prison in Rangoon, which is still there. The central jail is gone, so it's a different prison he's taken to from where Roy Pagani is. And while he's taken for trial, a lot of the Karens who aren't necessarily fully implicated are released and given a severe warning by the Japanese and allowed to go. But a sort of hardcore of them are put on trial. 7 of them plus Seagrim are lined up for arraignment, and 8 others as well. And the 8 others are given, I think it's 8 years of prison sentence. And it's a very formal court-martial proceedings. But immediately it starts, Seagrim says, "I am alone responsible for what's happened in the hills. You can do whatever you like to me. I'm the British agent in all of this. I've done this for Great Britain. I regret the war between Britain and Japan, but this is more or less my duty," to paraphrase what he was saying. But let the Karens go. They're not responsible. And he keeps repeatedly pleading for the Karens, which impresses the Japanese as well. But it's in vain, because they sentence them, 7 of them, to death. And Seagrim immediately says, "Well, I wish the sentence to be carried out immediately," which is pretty extraordinary. The Japanese then, the trial is over. The ones who are being sent off to prison are put to one side, and then the ones who are taken off to be executed are put on the back of a lorry. And as they're leaving, one of Seagrim's closest friends, who's given the prison sentence, waves to him. He says, goodbye to you all. And they're taken off on the back of a truck and taken to Chemendine, which is the execution ground for the Japanese, now the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery in Rangoon. And there's an intriguing postscript here, because on the same day, Pagani is in Rangoon's central jail, different jail, and thinks, or rather he's on sort of duty emptying of some warehouse buildings of some grain and things, and sees a truck with a load of prisoners on the back. And one of the prisoners waves to him, and he raises his hand in farewell, and he's not sure who it is, and then it dawns on him later that it's Seagrim being taken off. He thinks it's Seagrim being taken off to his execution. That memory lasts with him for the rest of his life. Whether it was or it wasn't, Pagani was convinced it was, and it had this profound effect on it. And it's, again, in terms of drama, a film, or whatever, theatre or something, it is an extraordinary, poignant moment with the 2 people having been separated for a while, seeing each other at the moment one is going to be taken off to be executed. Anyway, at Chemendine, the Karens and Seagrim are lined up. Contrary to a lot of reports that they were beheaded, they weren't. They were actually shot. And as they're lined up, they're allowed to sing the Karen hymn, which is called the Solid Rock, which they always sing when someone's going to their deaths. And they sing this. They're told to dig their own graves, and a number of the Karens begin to sort of quail at the prospect of having to do this. And Seagrim says, no, come on, let's do it, boys. And they dig their own graves. They're lined up and shot. And the Japanese accounts of the execution all say that Seagrim died with great composure. What an incredibly fine gentleman he was. The commander of the Japanese Kempotai in Rangoon said he's the finest gentleman I've ever met. Another Japanese officer said he should be regarded as a hero in his own country.
And they put this in the official reports, didn't they? Incredible.
Yeah, it's in the official papers, in the National Archives. The story of Seagrim sort of doesn't end there. He might have died thinking he'd failed in his job, but he didn't, because his legacy survives after the war. After his death, and it comes into its own at the end of the war. And by early 1945, it's very clear after Imphal and Kohima, British sweep back in this amazing campaign across Burma, one of the great campaigns of the war. And the Karens are having endured the Japanese tortures when they were looking for Seagrim, are pretty cowed by then. But British officers are again dropped into the hills on something called Operation Character. And this time they're really well equipped, arms, ammunition, equipment, no shortage of equipment at all, bedeviled Seagrim's efforts. And they go into the hills, a whole series of different groups, and raise the Karens again against the Japanese. And the Karens, in spite of everything they suffered, agree to go along with this, primarily because of Seagrim and what he'd done. And the Karens still regard even today Seagrim as a saint in the hills of eastern Burma. And as the British are sweeping down towards Rangoon, there's a race between the advancing British army and the retreating Japanese, and there's a key town of Tanju, which the British have to get to cut the Japanese off from retreating, and they could have held them there. Then the monsoons would have arrived, but they wouldn't have got to Rangoon, and the whole question of supply of the British army in Burma would have been in peril. They would have had long, long lines of communication from India rather than using the port in Rangoon. So this is a great race for Rangoon and for Tanju en route. And at that moment, Slim orders the British officers in the hills to raise the Karens, and they rise up and decimate the retreating Japanese. I think it's in 1 month, they kill more Japanese than the entire British Indian Army in the field. 12,000 Japanese casualties there, which is twice as many as the Japanese lost at Kohima. So this is astonishing, absolutely extraordinary victory, if you like, for very little cost in the hills. They prevent the Japanese from reaching Tanju as the stragglers of the Japanese army try and move across the rivers, the Salween and the Sitang. They are systematically, again, decimated by the British-led Karens. There's lines of Bren gun crews along the line of the river as the Japanese are trying to cross in rafts and all manner of different sort of contraptions. It's an absolutely astonishing victory, achieving far more than the Chindits ever did. Everyone's heard of the Chindits, but no one's heard of this. Seagrim's legacy, if you like, is this extraordinary victory in the hills that paves the way for the British to achieve the reconquest of Rangoon, and is probably, I think arguably, the most successful guerrilla operation of the entire Second World War. But no one's ever heard of it.
Well, typically of Burma, isn't it? No one's ever heard of it. I had to look up Operation Character. I wasn't familiar with it. It's, they are the forgotten army.
Absolutely, forgotten army, and then of course a forgotten country at the end of the war. The British leave Burma very quickly in 1947. A lot of people thought, well, why? What did we achieve? And actually, we achieved an astonishing victory. And it's also overshadowed by, of course, the atomic bombs on Japan. So it's right at the end of the war, and people sort of forget how profound an impact it had on that campaign. And I think one of the reasons for writing the book is that a lot of people think that the Far Eastern War was essentially an American-led operation of island hopping across the Pacific, which I'm not disparaging at all, and that that of course was hugely important strategically, but equally important was the victory in Burma. The Japanese suffered their greatest ever feat in their entire military history at the hands of the British Indian Army in Burma. By invading Burma, it was a strategic catastrophe for them. They lost most of the 180,000 troops that they sent in. About 3/5, I think, were killed. part of the reason for writing the book was to try and redress this balance in terms of assessing the importance of British contribution in the Far East in the Second World War. And it was of major significance.
Yeah, and it does. It completely gets overlooked. In fact, I have another one lined up somewhere. What have I got? Liberators over Burma. So I have two Burma episodes lined up. Now, Roy Pagani, you can't put the man down. What absolutely staggered me is at the end of the war, after everything, he re-enlists in the army.
Well, I mean, just to finish his story, I mean, he's obviously in the Rangoon Central Jail for a couple of years until April 1945. The Japanese asked for lists of people who are strong enough to endure leaving the prison, and those who are too sick should remain. Pagani immediately says, "Well, I'm strong enough. I go on, this march," thinking that we give him another chance to escape, yet again. And he joins this march from the prison, and the idea is that the Japanese will lead them eastward into back into Thailand and back into other prison camps. But he thinks he'll have a chance of escaping en route. And this journey turns into a complete nightmare for everybody involved. And as the British prisoners are marching, many of them barefoot on roads strewn with broken glass and debris, in the heat, it immediately becomes a death march. Anyone who's a straggler is shot by the wayside. Pagani stops to try and help someone, and they immediately just shoot the person he's trying to help. And this goes on for several days as they go eastward. They're even strafed by RAF planes because they're wearing, what looks like Japanese uniforms in the air. And they get to Pegu as the British are advancing south. And just in the nick of time, they're lying up in the jungle off the road, and a British column of trucks arrives, and Pagani and his colleagues are eventually liberated. And he's then flown back initially to India to recover, and then back home to his wife, who's not heard anything from him for 3 years, having actually fulfilled his promise to her that whatever happens, whatever occurs to him, he would always come back to her, which I think is incredibly moving, actually.
It is. Well, both stories are stories of faith, really, aren't they?
Absolutely, and he was also, in a very different way to Seagrim, was convinced that he was guided by God to Seagrim and guided, by God throughout all of his experiences, which is fascinating, I think. So he comes back to his wife, and family, and because of his experiences, and I was speaking to his daughters, and they said he was psychologically and physically, his back was physically scarred from being hacked to pieces virtually and tortured, but psychologically he was a remote figure. He never spoke about the war. He couldn't abide the sound of a dripping tap because of torture. He couldn't abide being barefoot because of his experiences. Remarkably, in spite of all of that, then re-enlists, actually becomes an army driver. He's even given the chance of possibly going back to Rangoon again on a sort of military mission, but he realises that he wouldn't be allowed to by the Burmese. So that's knocked on the head. But he carries on serving until he leaves the army and sets himself up as a sort of taxi driver, his own taxi service in Clacton, which he ran, so that's all business. One of his first clients was the man who was in charge of the camp in Sumatra when he was there, which is pretty extraordinary. But it clearly had a very, very deep impact on him. And when he, for instance, was on holiday in the south of France once with his family, he saw a Japanese who he was convinced was someone from one of the camps he was in, and went for him in the street and had to be physically restrained. He was typical sort of lion-hearted stoical British soldier who would just say, never say die.
And he couldn't put the man down.
The man down and was actually determined, whatever happened, always to find his way out of any situation and find his freedom. And he died in 2003. And just a month before I tracked him down, when I tracked him down, his family then were very helpful in letting me look through the family papers and telling me all about him. But what a remarkable individual. There were no obituaries in any of the papers anywhere for someone who'd achieved such a remarkable sort of wartime record. And he got scant recognition. He was given the military medal, but he never quite knew who put him up for it. And it came through the post never told why or anything. He was interviewed by MI9 after the war to sort of try and verify his story. When he gave a sort of detailed account of his exploits, and they came to the conclusion that this is exactly. They verified his story basically independently, and there's various other sort of witnesses at various different points in this journey that verified what he'd achieved, and yet hitherto, until the book came out, he's been completely forgotten and overlooked. And he should be regarded as amongst one of the greatest escapers of the Second World War. And Seagrim should be regarded, and so I think in the same light as T. Lawrence or Gordon of Khartoum as a great sort of imperial, colonial maverick, free thinker and guerrilla fighter.
Well, hopefully we can steer people to the book and get these men's stories heard. Thanks for joining me, Philip. The book is Lost Warriors, Seagrim and Pagani of Burma, the last great untold story of World War II. I will put a link on the website. As I think we said, that the truth is certainly stranger than fiction. So I'm joined by Bob Forsick for the next episode. I talked to Bob last year about Operation Sea Lion. This time out, we'll be discussing the closing weeks of the Battle for France in 1940. If you listen to a lot of podcasts, it seems very in vogue at the moment to ask for a review on iTunes if you enjoy the show. I'm led to believe it'll help get the podcast noticed, which is always a great thing, and it also helps stroke my ego. So it would be lovely if you have the time to leave me a review. So that's it for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.